a really, really concerning move, and one that's really in line with what we're seeing out of the more kind of conservative religious Republican states in the United States, so places like Florida and Texas. So it's really concerning. The first thing is that, especially at the level of puberty blockers, well, the point is to pause puberty and prevent endogenous pubertal development in order to give more time. More time for who? Frankly, primarily more time for the parents and for clinicians, much more than the youth who oftentimes know that they want to go on and take hormone therapy. So it's already a bit of a compromised position in the first place. But now what's concerning is they'll have to go through puberty all the way up to 16 when, you've already gone through quite a lot of the puberty. And that will mean a lot of pubertal development will have happened. A lot of trans guys, for instance, will have grown breasts. And in many cases, that will mean having to have additional surgeries that the youth could have avoided later on. Of course, not all trans men will want to get a mastectomy, and it's very individualized, but it remains a fact that a large number will want and don't want to develop breast tissue, and now will have to have surgeries in order to prevent that, rather than just taking puberty blockers. So, despite the claim that this is about keeping youth's futures open, it actually forecloses them in a pretty significant way. But other impacts are very serious as well. We're talking about mental health impacts, in terms of depression, suicidality, anxiety, and things like that. It can also have, being precluded from accessing hormones and puberty blockers can also have a really severe negative impact on self-trust, which can have a lasting impact in terms of long-term development and relationships, right? Essentially, the government is saying you can't be trusted to know yourself enough to access this care. And so, what you're learning from that is not to trust yourself, and also that your deep sense of self doesn't matter. And then you kind of carry that through in your future interactions, and you internalize that. And that can lead to like dysfunctional relationships throughout the lifetime. And a lot of trans people have to heal from that through all their adulthood, and a lot of people, never fully heal from that message of like, don't trust who you know yourself to be. Apart from that, there's also a broader impact in terms of like, we have to think about this in terms of preventing youth from living out their gender identity, right? Just imagine if you had a youth who is not trans and then gets forced to live as the opposite gender, like say a cis boy gets forced to live as a girl. In society, we think that that's pretty horrendous, right? We think that the youth has a right to live in their gender identity. Well, it's the same thing for trans youth. What you're doing here is not just saying, oh, you can't access this medical intervention, you can just get it later on. It's also saying, we're going to make it much harder, if not impossible, for you to fully live out your identity. And for a lot of youth, being able to there is this sense that you're going to get more misgendered if you don't have access to puberty blockers. But also, there are all of these kind of self-image issues where you don't feel like you're quite yourself, where you feel like your embodiment goals and your body aren't in alignment, and so you have this disjunction between your identity and your body that can make it very difficult to have a healthy psychological life, but also a healthy social life, right? Because gender is such a huge part of our social interaction, be it just how most of our terms for interpersonal relationships are gendered, right? It's boyfriend, girlfriend, it's mother, daughter, son, right? All of these terms are gendered, really reflecting the amount of social importance that's put into that. And now we're saying, well, we're not going to let you live out that identity fully. We're going to limit that. And of course, that has negative impacts. And most notably, one of the ways in which we notice it is trans youth often being kind of a little bit hermits, right? Struggling to go outside, struggling to develop relationship because they don't feel like they can be their authentic self, and they don't feel seen, and they don't feel mirrored in society. So that's another big impact we'll see with this ban. And frankly, like, the cost of the ban is going to be measured in lives taken and lives ruined.
Right.
The evidence is that first is that testosterone has actually a really complex effect on sports performance. One way to conceptualize it is that there's kind of two factors for the impact of testosterone. There's your the level of testosterone in your body, and then there's the body's receptiveness to the testosterone, which is why, for instance, you will have people who actually have a Y chromosome, develop this and actually produce testosterone, but never develop any traits that are typically associated with testosterone. And it is largely because their body is not responsive to the testosterone. So their receptors for testosterone aren't responsive. So that's the first thing. And in sport, we've actually noticed that quite interestingly, at the elite level, testosterone levels are actually unusually low, right? So in elite sports, both among elite women and among elite men, a lot of sports, it varies a little bit from sport to sport, but a lot of sports have unusually low testosterone, and not just kind of speed sports like powerlifting inclusively, which tells us that testosterone's impact on performance is actually a lot more complicated than is assumed. So that's the first part.
Mm.
The second part is that studies do tend to show that when trans feminine people go on hormone replacement therapy, they lose performance in a way that tends to keep the same relative level of performance. Of course, that is complicated by a few factors, most notably where the person starts training more, right? Because, and which happens a lot with trans people, right? Because if you have a lot of trouble with your body and stuff like that, you might be less interested in sport. But then the moment you start feeling better in yourself and in your own skin, you might start, basically doing more activity and stuff like that, and so increase the quality of your participation. But when we look at elite athletes, they tend to stick to the same relative kind of position, and a lot of misinformation is based on, well, misleading people around that. So Leah Thomas, who and in terms of like the swimming, there's often this claim of like, oh, she went from being 216th to being number 2 or number 3, but no, she was like number 5 before transitioning. Then she started hormones, dipped all the way to 216 because she was still competing against men while on hormones, and then eventually hit the eligibility period for competing against women, started competing against women, and essentially hiked back to around the same spot, right? Like being like third versus sixth, something around like that. So around the same kind of relative sport, but relative performance. But another thing is that even if there were an advantage, we have to think about comparable allowed advantages. The reality is that in women's sports, tons of advantages are allowed. Nobody is suggesting that we ban people who are 5 feet 8 and over from the WNBA, despite the fact that the WNBA is immensely tall. In fact, much taller in terms of percentile, a much rarer height than trans people are rare from the general population. So we're looking at something that's quite extraordinary in terms of that advantage, but that's not seen as posing a problem. So one thing we also have to keep in mind is not just the fact that evidence of advantage has been extremely weak and the burden is on those who oppose inclusion. That's kind of the whole principle of human rights, is that you are presumed to have equal access until somebody can show that it's really important to make a distinction in that manner. But not only that, but also look at like what are the advantages that we're allowing, because from my perspective, until you can show that trans women have such an advantage that it's beyond the type of advantage that we normally allow in women's sport, then trans women should be allowed to continue participating. And I don't think we're remotely close to that. At most, we may have evidence of a very marginal advantage in some sports, but that's not even a given. A lot of it comes down to the fact that if you study a lot of different sports, and a lot of different kind of uh, uh, types of activities, at some point you're going to have a few positives in difference because, well, not to go too much into the detail, but there's a concept called p hacking, and it has to do with statistics. And if you throw enough stuff at the wall, some things will stick, not because they're meant to stick, but because things just kind of stick once in a while by pure chance. The legal domain and discipline will not save us. Courts will not save us. We will save us. So love trans youth and love trans people louder and harder than all of the hate, and not just symbolically, but materially. There's a need for material support of trans people, both broadly as a movement, but also individually. People need jobs, people need housing, people need friends, love, people need a place where they can just sit it out and not think about this deluge of absolute manure that's coming onto us. So, go hug a trans person, buy them a pizza, buy them my book.